In the last module, you learned about working with files and creating error handling. So the error handling code you're going to see here is not new to you. What is different is that I'm now putting that error handling code in the constructor. So here I've got an example. I declare a attribute. I'll just set it as a default value before I even start trying to assign the parameter to it, because I want to check out the parameter first. And I'll do that by going through and saying, okay, is it true that the name is a numeric value? I'm using a built-in function called isNumeric. And if it comes out as a number without any character data in it, that will be true. It'll raise a value error, which will jump down to the accept block, and in this case, print out the standard error that comes with Python and my own custom error message. Otherwise, it'll just go through and set the parameter to the attribute. I'm going to go ahead and format it by using Python's title formatting. That'll put an uppercase level, a letter in it. So this pretty easy to do. So if I pass in Bob, lowercase b, it's going to print out as Bob uppercase b because I've got the title function. So I've done some formatting. And if I try to type in just a number, even if it's in, parentheses there are in quotes around it, so it acts as a string, it won't be fooled by this. It'll figure out that it is a number. Now, if I do pass it in, as just 1, 2, 3, isNumeric is not a part of an integer. So I need to convert it to a string before I actually try to use the isNumeric. That's why the string function is in here. But I pass over a string, it doesn't matter. The string function is there. I pass over a number, still doesn't matter. It's going to convert it to a string, and it's going to check it out. Hey, is it numeric? And if it is, it's going to raise an error message. And it's going to give my little error message here. Now there is a problem. Remember that we set the initial value in the constructor, but if you go through and you try to add a value after the fact, it'll accept it. So I'm working with the attribute directly, and I'm not going through the constructor because the constructor only runs once when the object is created. So that's an issue that we need to fix, and we will fix it shortly. Before we do, let's talk about some other things. Sometimes you don't want people to work with the attribute directly. You only want them to work with it through a method. Well, one way you can do that is to mark it as private. And in Python, the way you mark it as private is you put 2 underscores in front of it. I know it looks like one long thing, but it's actually 2. Once again, this is called a dunder, double underscore. I think the name is silly, but it doesn't matter. That's what we call it anyway in Python. This actually marks it as private. So the idea is that you should not be able to interact with it from outside of the class. Inside the class, you can interact with it. It's private to the class itself. So any code inside the class can work with it. Like let's say we got 5 functions in the class. All 5 of those functions can work with it. But the code that makes an object from the class and calls it, that shouldn't have any access to it because it's private. It should only be available from inside it. Now, Python is not rigorous on how it enforces this privacy. Most other languages, when you mark something as private, it enforces it. With Python, it does enforce it for some things and not for other things, which is really kind of odd, but that's just the way it is. In general, it's considered a best practice for everybody involved to, if you not do that. If it's marked up as private, you look at the code, you see a double underscore in there, treat it as if it's private. Don't try to assign a value to it. Just it's supposed to be blocked off. Now, if it's blocked off, how do you assign a value to it? Well, you do so by making another method, and you let the other method interact with it. So the other method is known as a getter or setter. And they basically access the data or they change the data, mutate the data. So they're also known as accessors and mutators. What they're also typically called is a property function, property method, property procedure. The name varies, but in general, depending on the language, but in general, people just call them properties. So these are special functions, and their job in life is to manage attribute data or field data in other languages. And you will create two of these property procedures for each attribute, one to get the data, one to set the data. And again, they're called getters, setters, accessors, or mutators. These are just other ways of referring to them. Now, a getter property procedure, function, method, whatever, a getter lets you access the data and optionally add some formatting. So the way you type it out is you define a function with the same, the name that you, of the function you want to refer to. So I'm not going to put an underscore, first underscore name there or string or anything like that. It's just a method call. So I'm just going to call it first name. And that's the one, it's not private, it's something that I want people to interact with. So when they go my object dot first name, they're going to interact with this function, this method, this property. I still have to have the self keyword because I'm interacting with the object itself. But it doesn't do much other than the fact that it does format it in title casing just like I did in my constructor code. The setter is very similar. It's a method. It's got the same name. The method has the same name. But you have a decorator in front of it that's different. So for the getter, you put in the decorator of property. For the setter, you don't. And I don't know why they chose this. This seems like the most confusing thing that they could have picked. But they did, and we're stuck with it now. If it had been me, I would have said at getter and at setter and called it good. But nope, that's not where they did it. Instead, what you have to do is you have to refer to the previous function that you want to connect together. So this reference here is referring to the getter's function name, method name, property name. And I'm using those terms over and over again just so that you get used to thinking of them. They're all the same thing. Property is just a method that is used to get or set something. And if it's something to set something, you use the name of the method, the property that is your getter, and you use .setter to indicate that. I know. My brain just wants to stop thinking at that point now because it just seems so silly. But don't let that stop you. Just move on. The name of the method should be the same. I think I've tested this before, and it doesn't have to be because this part here is the most important part. But they, make it match to get it. That's the best thing to do. That way, it's really obvious. And I'm setting a value, so I need to pass a value in. You don't have to call the parameter value, but I don't see why not. It indicates what it is. Then you take that value and assign it to your attribute, even if it's private. Because remember, this property procedure is inside the class, so I can still access it. Now I do want to do some validation here. So before I actually set the value, I check to see if the value is numeric. And if it's not numeric, in other words, it comes back as false, then I can go ahead and set it. Otherwise, I'll raise an error exception saying, hey, names can't be numbers. So I've just taken that validation logic and I split it up, or put it in the setter, and I put the formatting logic or code in the getter. And that's a common task for you to do. They are now these two functions, these two property procedures, these two properties. They're now responsible for managing the attribute, the private attribute. So the setter decorator function must match the name of the getter function. Again, that's very important. Otherwise, it's not considered a pair. That is very unique to Python. It's just a way somebody decided that's how it's going to work. Now, once we have the property procedures in place, we can take that validation code out of the constructor. And this makes the constructor a little bit simpler to use. So I don't have to go through and refer to the attribute. in the constructor anymore, which seems kind of weird, right? But it's referred to in the property procedure, and oddly enough, that's sufficient. Because you're not really using it anyway. It's private to the class. So you're not supposed to use it from outside the class anyway. So we get rid of the attribute listed in the constructor and we just use the property. If we're setting a value, we're using the setter. We don't have to indicate that. It knows if you've got a value on the right-hand side of the assignment operator, the equal, and there you got a property on the other side, it knows that that's the setter to use. So it's automatic, it's implied. So here's an example. Got the first name going in there. I've got my property here for my getter when I'm changing the title. And here I've got the setter and I'm doing the validation logic. And then when I want to use it, I just go through and I can still pass in Bob the constructor into the constructor, but it will immediately pass it over to the setter, which identifies, validates that it is not numeric. And then it goes ahead and sets the value or gives me an error message if it is. And we can see that that's happening here in this image. So Robert is lowercase here. The title in the getter, when we print it out, is going to be uppercase. So the setter received it as Robert. The getter changes the R to uppercase because I have it at title casing. And of course, the second time we try this, it doesn't work because I am passing in a number. So we don't use fields or attributes in the Python constructor if we're using property procedures. This has always been a confusing point for students because I had to talk about fields and then I had to talk about attributes and then I have to tell you we're using the property procedures. I know it feels kind of like a bait and switch thing going on here, but you do have to understand the attribute concept and the field concept to understand how other languages work later on. So it's for the long game, as the saying goes. The idea is to help you in the future. But let's just concentrate on how it's going to work by practicing it in this next lab. We're going to switch everything over to the property procedures. Once again, I recommend you try to type it out. If you can't type it out, then if you have a problem, you can always do some copying and pasting. But give it a try. It's kind of an important thing to do. And as always, I'll let you go ahead and test it out, make sure it works. Again, you can just test it in PyCharm or you can test it in the console window. Doesn't matter really at the end of all this. The code, of course, is the code from listing 9 to help guide you. I'll go ahead and pause it, and then we'll talk about it more when you come back. Okay, so here we are. Now, this is what I've got typed out now. It's not quite right. So let me, I'm going to show you that it's, even though it's not right, it's still going to work kinda. You can see the code here. I'm passing in Bob Smith. I run this, I get Bob Smith. Looks great. I'm going to go ahead and try to pass in a number now. 1, 2, 3. I run it. Oh, what happened to my validation? Well, to tell you the truth, this is actually code running in the constructor. And this constructor doesn't have any validation anymore because I removed it. I put it in the property procedures. Now, if I try to set the value later, no, it's not going to be happy about that because that at that point it uses the property procedure. So this means that we don't want to do this. We want to do this. We want to put in the first name and last name so it uses the property. And again, we don't even need the fields. We can just get rid of those. The only reason why I'm leaving them in right now is so I can refer back to them. Okay, so so now, when I try to do this, I can expect an error message because it's going to try to use that property procedure. What did you do wrong? Okay, give me a second to troubleshoot this. I'm doing something silly. Yeah, I told you it was silly. If you actually don't put the validation code in the property, it doesn't work. Go figure. Okay, so the problem was is I didn't have the validation code down here. Now, I copy and paste it, and this is where I always mess up. I forget to change it, right? There we go, last name. And it's got me numbers. Oh yeah, that should work now. Yes, exactly. So now it will work in the constructor. And of course, it'll also work if I try to change it later too. So this works fine, but if I try to use a property later and make a change, I can expect an error message, and that's exactly what I get. So hopefully that makes sense. The homework assignment this week is obviously creating classes, and this is the pattern you want to follow to make them work correctly. Okay, next up, I want to talk about other methods that you can add besides just the property methods, the properties that we're looking at. Let's talk about some other ones that can go into your classes. I'll see you there.